Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we talk terrorists and taxes. In the second half of our show, we're pleased to welcome back Grover Norquist, founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform, to discuss his new book, End the IRS Before It Ends Us. Up first, we're joined by retired four-star General Michael Hayden, former director of both the NSA and the CIA, now in private life as a principal in the Chertoff Group. General, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill.
General, the federal government spends countless billions protecting us from terrorists, yet we're 5,000 times more likely to be killed by preventable medical errors. We're 2,000 times more likely to die in a car accident. We're 350 times more likely to die falling off a ladder. We're even 4 times more likely to be struck by lightning than to be killed by terrorists. Is our concern about terrorism disproportionate to the actual threat?
Well, Bill, the first answer I'd give you is no, all right? But there are subtexts there that are very important. Number one, maybe we're able to have those proportions you just quoted because we've actually been very successful against a terrorist threat. I mean, nobody would have been doing that math 14 years ago on September 12th. And so the fact that we're able to make those kinds of comparisons might be a reflection that we're actually getting pretty good at making ourselves safer. The second thing I'd point out to you is that none of the things you just suggested were done to change American behavior. None of them were done for a political purpose. None of them were done to coerce America or Americans into courses of action that we would not otherwise take. So in that sense, I think we're fine. Now, all that said, Bill, we really need to be very careful. I have to tell you that my job at CIA was the most present tense job I had in 40 years in government. It was all about the here and now, and a whole bunch of the here and now was counterterrorism, and when it wasn't terror, it was proliferation. I think my old agency, the entire American security establishment, needs to take care that it doesn't overfixate on the urgent and thereby pass up the important. There are a lot of other things going on in the world, too.
Well, we'll get to that. But I want to return to the big concern that many Americans have, which is the trade-off between privacy and security. From a technical perspective, what's the difference between targeted electronic surveillance, in which an agency is tracking a suspect, and wholesale data collection and archiving using the internet and telecom networks as a giant sponge? Yeah.
Well, obviously, even civil libertarians, and I had the great good fortune to debate Glenn Greenwald on a stage in Toronto last May. Even folks like Greenwald claim that, I'm not against you guys going after the bad people. Well, there are a lot of realities out there, Bill, that make going after the bad people hard. Number one is just the explosion of global communications. And so in order to be able to find the bad people in this massive data, you pretty much have to be able to have at least access to the data, which is different than collecting it.
Yeah, I don't think there's a problem with the access.
Yeah, but an awful lot of the stories go out there confuse access with collection. They quote numbers that are the theoretical rather than the actual when it comes to collection. And theoretical collection is defined as access. So that's one thing. The second thing, Bill, and this is very important, most of my career was in the Cold War. Target was the Soviet Union. There isn't a civil libertarian alive who gave a damn about Soviet communications, and we were all over them. But the 21st century equivalent of those Soviet communications, that is, communications of people who intend to do us harm, are proliferator, terrorist, narco-trafficker, money launderer communications that, frankly, Bill, are out there with your emails and mine. They're coexisting in the same global telecommunications space. In fact, most of them are Gmail. And so if you want NSA and other security organizations to do what they did for you in the Cold War, they're just going to have to be able to touch these wires, so to speak, in which your communications and mine are scooting around with these bad guy communications.
So, General, let's stay with that for a moment. If access is the most important thing, why are we building a giant facility out in the desert with many, many petabytes of storage?
Well, first thing, Bill, we've got to define the terms of our discussion here, okay? I'm sure NSA can fill that facility with foreign collection. Now, is your concern about the privacy rights of Americans, or do you have some more ephemeral concern about some broad human right to privacy. And I don't mean to be flip about this. It's really important because I grew up in a world that was pretty Manichaean, pretty binary. You were or you were not protected by the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
I don't think there's anything in the Constitution that protects foreigners.
That I'm with you.
It's not about me, it's about the Constitution. And so I don't think you have to give answers to that. That's a wholly political question.
Exactly right. Now, Bill, the truth of the matter is, though, when you're out there gathering data, Americans are so ubiquitous in this world that invariably NSA will pick up what the phrase we used is communications to, from, or about protected persons, i.e. Americans, or, frankly, anyone practically inside the United States. That isn't post 9/11. Mm-hmm. That isn't post George Bush. That isn't Barack Obama. That began with Harry Truman in 1952 when he started the National Security Agency. It's called incidental collection. There is no way NSA at any point in its history could do its job without picking up stuff about Americans. But there are strict rules they have to follow in order to deal with that.
Well, back in the 1970s when I worked at Predivestra Bell Labs in what was then the nation's electronic communications monopoly, both open and clandestine communications and cooperation with our security agencies was very tight. How has that changed in the age of the Internet?
Well, first of all, it's going to be very hard for me to be able to comment specifically about any cooperative relationship. But in general, I am very free to say that American security has been blessed by the fact that this global telecommunications system we've been talking about is, frankly, for an American, it's a home game. We are the center of the Internet universe, and that has made American intelligence advantaged compared to other intelligence services around the world. Now, here, Bill, I don't even have to suggest anything nefarious or secret or backdoor. The fact that American industry has built this thing is just a built-in advantage for NSA and folks like that.
Well, there is some concern that there's such a high level of cooperation that back doors are being slipped into products being sold to foreigners, and this is going to besmirch America's reputation in the market.
Now you've come to the real hardcore practical question, not the philosophical about whether it might or might not be legitimate, but what are the practical effects of this real or alleged cooperation between American industry and American intelligence. And here, Bill, I am actually sympathetic to industry. I mean, look, I know they all started somewhere in a garage in California, okay? But they are now American-based but truly international companies. And one of the great misfortunes of the Snowden revelations is that he frankly dimed out and frankly I think exaggerated the relationship of American industry with American espionage. American business doesn't do anything for the American government that French, German, or any other country's industry doesn't do for their government. But Snowden was an American, so he dimed out American industry, and American industry is suffering now because, frankly, they were doing what was, in my view, just the right thing.
Edward Snowden is viewed as a traitor by some and a hero to others. Had he blown the whistle on surveillance and stayed in the U.S. to defend his actions rather than fled to Russia, would your opinion of him be any different?
It would be different. It probably wouldn't be good, just to be candid, Bill, but it would be different. Let me tell you Snowden's problem. And here I'm not trying to be sympathetic towards him, but there's some facts here that need to be focused on. Snowden's issue was this. He was offended by what NSA was doing, but in no way could he show that what NSA was doing was illegal. I mean, it had been approved by 2 presidents, legislated by the Congress, overseen by the court. I'm fond of saying that's the Madisonian trifecta in the American system. He just didn't like it. And frankly, even if he had come to the Hill and laid out his complaints, he would have had probably Senator Wyden and a few others on the Senate Intel Committee saying, son, I agree with you totally, but I keep getting outvoted in committee 13-2. And that's the reality.
If he had stayed, would he have received a fair and public trial where all Americans could judge him, or would he have been spirited off to a secret dungeon?
Well, here's the deal. He had multiple options, and one was to work within the system. He claims that he made complaints inside the NSA structure about what was going on. And the man ripped and stripped 1.5 million documents. Could somebody just produce an email where he actually said that and got a response from the agency that told him to go pound sand? And so I don't think he exhausted the avenues he had within the system. Now, I get it. I already explained to you that his complaint would have been, yeah, but everyone knows and approves this who needs to know and approve. But what he did was to make a whole bunch of stuff public. And Bill, let's be very candid here, all right? 95% of the stuff he made public has nothing to do with your privacy or mine.
Yeah.
It's about how America collects intelligence.
So, General, let's widen out the scope globally.
Sure.
You recently wrote a piece titled Ignoring the Religious Roots of Terrorism Risks Victory. All three of the main Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have gone through periods of tremendous violence. The Jews under the Romans, the Christians from the Middle Ages through the 17th century, and Islam in the past and today. How much of this is directly connected to the first commandment? I am the Lord thy God, and thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Bill, it's a great question, and let me give you an answer. Human beings are capable of horrible stuff when they think they're doing the will of the Creator. And that may be one of the issues we are facing here. I was very careful in that article to be very respectful of Islam. I called it one of the world's great monotheisms. I said we are all people of the book. We are all children of Abraham. All three of us evolved out of the same deserts. All
with the same sins of violence.
We have all gone through our periods, as you have just described. But, you know, Christendom made a compromise in the middle of the 17th century at the end of the 30 Years' War. And my very flippant, probably too irreverent description of it was simply this. At that point in 1648, Christendom said, you know what? We got lots of reasons we want to kill one another. Let's just scratch religion off the list. And by and large, I mean, it's been imperfect, but by and large, we have done that. We separated the sacred and the secular in our public life. It remains to be seen, Bill, if one of the other great monotheisms, Islam, makes that same kind of compromise. By the way, we in the West, and I understand I've got cultural blinders on here, okay? We in the West call that compromise modernity.
We seem to be in the middle of a Sunni-Shiite sectarian war. It's now spread far and wide. Most recently, the White House has attempted a rapprochement with Iran, and the first step in that has been this so-called framework agreement. On the framework agreement, you've been quoted as saying, we don't have a deal, and those things we've claimed have been agreed to, a negotiating partner has said are not agreed to, and even the French have a white paper out there that's inconsistent with our views. What's going on? You know, I truly don't know. And that is really cause for great concern because, Bill, people like you and I try to follow this stuff. And so one of the practical outcomes of this concern is my desire, let's get another political branch of government involved in this. Let's let Congress take a look at this. Now, look, how Congress does that is debatable, and I'll let those folks up there work it out. Isn't that required by the Constitution?
Technically, probably not. The Constitution gives the executive a lot of running room when it comes to foreign affairs, but this is so fundamental a document. Bill, let me answer your question a slightly different way. I did a lot of things in the Bush administration, the terrorist surveillance program at NSA, detentions and interrogations, renditions at CIA. They were all perfectly legal, and you can probably tell from the tone of my voice, I'm happy I did it. But I do recognize one thing now. Presidents get to do things one-off based upon raw Article II authorities. Presidents don't get to do really important things over extended periods of time without putting their arms around the other political branch and getting consensus. I do think that the administration, for its own purposes, really needs to get Congress into the game.
Well, President Obama has characterized the path ahead as a choice between this deal or war. Are there no other options?
No, there are other options. Now, look, I freely admit, when we left government in January 2009, this was an ugly baby we were handing off to the Obama administration. And so everything I now say that describes it as an ugly baby, you need to keep in mind, we didn't make it any prettier. But there are options. That is a false dilemma the president is creating. And frankly, I think it's beneath the arguments that he is actually able to make in favor of the deal. And I don't agree with all the arguments, but there are legitimate concerns and a legitimate case to be made, but it's not because the only other option here is war. There are other choices that we have.
Do you forecast that they will produce a single piece of paper that both parties sign at the end of this process, later in the year?
I would not put the odds at greater than even. I really don't. And frankly, Bill, given the performance of the Iranians after the so-called framework agreement here, I think I might actually be really frightened if we pretend we do have an agreement at some point in the future.
Well, talking about pretending, to what extent has the prevailing narrative become more important in American politics than actual facts?
How do you mean in terms of prevailing narrative?
A story gets promoted by the White House, gets picked up by a cooperative press, and the facts get ignored. There are actually people out there who think we've signed a deal with Iran. Oh,
yeah. Actually, it's a byproduct of the hyper-partisan atmosphere here. You watch the 7x24 networks, Bill, and they don't give people like you're giving me, a couple dozen minutes to actually discuss. It's 3 and 4 minute sound bites, so everybody's working from talking points.
Yeah.
It's really, really disappointing. These are complex issues, and the American people are smart enough to digest them. But what you get, it's just easy to fill the airtime having two people screaming at one another, and then you sign off to commercial. That's why I've actually been on TV above average for a former CIA chief. And my goal there is just to give credit to everyone that these are hard questions. And then even when I disagree with the administration, I'm actually fond of saying, I've been in these sit-room meetings. I don't envy these guys this decision.
General, from a global strategic perspective, what do you make of the administration's efforts to achieve rapprochement with Iran, and how does that impact our relationships with the rest of the Arab world?
The centrality of the Iranian approach is so important that it's affecting an awful lot, in my view, of our foreign policy. I think it affects our Iraq policy. It certainly affects our Syria policy. I think it actually affects our Russian and Ukraine policy, too, because we need to keep the Russians on side for the nuclear agreement. People look at the negotiations and say, I fear we've got two bad outcomes here. One is no deal and the other is a bad deal. Let me say something a little outlandish, Bill. I see a third possible bad outcome, and that's a good deal. And let me explain what I mean by that. If we get to some sort of an agreement with the Iranians, and I'll be nervous and probably complaining about the details, all right? But let's just say we get to some sort of an agreement. You realize now, Iran gets out of the penalty box. Iran becomes a quote-unquote normal nation. Particularly European companies rush to Iran. They sell oil. The coffers get filled. And they're still the state they are today, which is Hamas supporting, Hezbollah funding, Iraq destabilizing, terrorists supporting Islamic Republic. I can actually see that even a so-called good deal leads to a worse situation in the Middle East.
Well, you're certainly helping us all sleep at night.
I used to read the PDB in the morning and then all the stuff that wasn't ready for prime time in my book. That's the first hour of my day. I famously said at one point, it's hard to have faith in human nature after reading that book.
Last question on the global issues, and then let's come back to American privacy. Americans don't like being spied on, but most could care less about spying on foreigners. What's happened to the human element of intelligence? The administration seems to have been blindsided by a number of developments, the most recent being the collapse of the government in Yemen, which right up until then was held up as a success story.
Yeah, I know. A couple of dynamics at work here, all right? Number one, Bill, I think we all agree the clock's been speeded up globally. Things happen faster now because of interconnectivity. The second thing is something I call the phenomenon of the unpleasant fact. And it's not confined to this administration. It's something intelligence officers know a lot about. And that is when you go in and you're briefing a decision maker with data and a narrative that cuts across the decision maker's policy or narrative or politics, it takes a lot longer to convince the decision maker that they had it wrong.
Yeah.
And I think we might be seeing that in a lot of things right now.
Confirmation bias is a problem in any kind kind of research.
That's it.
In the time left, let's get back to American privacy issues. And I need to ask, have you read any of David Brin's writing on privacy, in particular his book, The Transparent Society?
I have not.
I recommend it to you. His basic position is that privacy is dead. Get used to it. And what really matters is who watches the watchers. His solution is we all watch the watchers. What's your solution?
Well, we've entered a new era, and millennials have a different view of this than perhaps you and I do. I said in a talk up in British Columbia, that it was the provincial get-together on privacy and security. And I said, privacy is the line we negotiate, continually negotiate, between ourselves as a unique creature of God and ourselves as social animals. And so this negotiation goes on continuously. I actually think that technology has driven that line in directions that maybe a lot of us didn't expect, and maybe a whole bunch of us still don't understand. And so it might very well be that this is the correct approach, that you cannot deny in a digitized world, you cannot deny people access to more information about you than they've ever had before. But if there are certain rules and norms as to how that information can be used, that may actually offer us a way forward. So I look forward to reading that.
General, on the issue of getting used to not having privacy, since the passage of the 16th Amendment authorizing the income tax, Americans have been forced to surrender their financial privacy. We've been accustomed to being reported on by our banks, our employers, basically anyone we exchange money with, and all these people have been dragooned into being unpaid agents of the IRS.
Yeah.
Despite this, you rarely hear civil libertarians complaining about our lack of financial privacy. Why do you suppose that is?
Because I think we've all agreed, the big we, the 330 million we, that this is something necessary in order to continue to have a democratic and civilized society. It's a price we have to pay. And that's why, Bill, when we get to NSA kinds of activities, I said, look, this is not an argument between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Free societies need both liberty and safety. And therefore, let's have an adult conversation and not assume that the people on the other side of the table somehow are unpatriotic or un-American. These are tough questions. We won't get very far deciding them just calling each other names.
General, you've given us a lot to think about. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Bill.
That was retired four-star General Michael Hayden, former director of both the NSA and the CIA, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter, Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Ahead, Grover Norquist, founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform, explains why he believes President Obama used the IRS to stamp out the growth of the Tea Party and steal the 2012 election. Stay tuned.